Well, look, on the back half of the show, a real pleasure to welcome on the program Peter Menzies. He's one of our stars of a surging hub podcast called The Full Press, where every 2 weeks we dig into the latest developments in Canadian media. He's a former vice chair of the CRTC and a seasoned newspaper man, an ink-stained wretch of the highest order. Peter, great to have you on the program.
Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to see you guys.
Want to talk subsidies with you, Peter. Sean and I would confess that the last 48 hours or so have been a little bit grim in the Hub's kind of quixotic battle to call the media out on subsidies. And the reason for that, Peter, isn't simply that, as expected, Mark Carney has reaffirmed large-scale funding increases for the CBC, has basically been quiet on subsidies, but that quiet, I think, speaks volumes that the entire subsidy regime that funds now half of all journalists' salaries in Canada will remain in place in a Carney government. I think what kind of knocked Sean and I for a loop was the Conservative platform doubling funding for the Local Journalism Initiative. This is a program established by the Trudeau government to fund local papers, but it's also found its way into larger outfits, subsidizing journalists on the basis of their coverage of issues that the government kind of selects, gently or not. Peter, what do you make of it all? And what do you make of the Conservatives embracing a key plank of the Trudeau government's subsidy regime?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, what I make of it is that the era of a free, independent, trusted media in Canada is finished. It's done. That's the end of it. There won't be any going back. And we won't read much about it. Maybe we will in the Hub. Maybe we will in Blacklock's Reporter, Western Standard. A handful of holdouts if they can hold out as the years goes by, because I expect those subsidies will just get bigger. My main take on it is that basically the shakedown of the political parties by what you'd want to call, I guess, big media in that sense, has succeeded. They finally got to the point where it's politically unaffordable to not give them money, right? It's almost like I was recalling the Niagara Now incident from last summer, right?
Yes.
Where,
a recipient incidentally of the Local Journalism Initiative, precisely the program that the Conservatives have committed to doubling.
Yeah, and pretty much losing its mind over Poilievre saying that he was going to cancel these subsidies. It was Katie Telford, the chief of staff for Justin Trudeau, tweeted that it was the longest editorial ever written. But at the end of the day, Niagara Now wins, right? That they kind of like bullied the Conservatives. The media have successfully bullied the Conservatives into giving them money too. So now there's nobody who won't give them money. So in future elections, it'll just be, it won't be whether or not they get money.
Yeah.
It'll be how much. It'll be an auction.
Yeah, I think that's right, Roger and Peter. There are opportunities when these policies start to take shape in a short window to contest them, but at a certain point they become part of the furniture, and everyone accepts them as the new baseline. And as Peter says, you stop revisiting old policies and you start talking about how to expand them. And I think that's precisely right. What do you think, though? Let's go a bit deeper, Daryl, because Peter, because as you say, not only did Poilievre signal then his intention to, if not repeal, then certainly reform these programs, as early as days leading up to this election campaign, in a podcast interview with Juno News, he promised that his platform would set out the details on a conservative reform to the panoply of media subsidies. This is a clear broken promise from the Conservative leader. Talk a bit more about what you think explains it.
I mean, what I think explains it is political pressure, right? They're obviously under pressure. They need as few fights as possible down the stretch if they're to have any chance at all here. So that's my assumption in terms of that. That a lot of those, especially a lot of those smaller town media, they're really tied into this. very
very
afraid of
dependent.
the Conservatives, cutting that off in that sense. So I think the Conservatives probably got a lot of pressure on that file, or felt a lot of pressure in terms of that, to try to keep, I guess I'd call it boomer media, um, on side in that sense. Because I mean, if you want to reach boomers, that's how you do it. Is
Yeah,
like you go to the um, legacy media, because
yeah.
the younger people don't vote for that. And this is sort of this the one thing about this election. It could be the last stand of the boomers, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Yes.
um, they'll be around for a bit yet, but their numbers are in decline.
Yeah. Peter, I want to go back to what you said just about how this represents a watershed moment in the industry that your career, was reflected in over your decades of engagement with the media and press as an editor, publisher, and writer. When you put together, let's say, the most likely outcome of this election, a Mark Carney win, and you have a CBC potentially doubled if he truly wants to bring it up to a per capita funding model equivalent to, let's say, European public broadcasters, and then add over on top of that these massive public subsidy sectors to private broadcasters and digital news outlets. What the heck does that do, Peter, to the whole kind of info ecosystem that all of us exist in? What kind of
Yeah,
dystopian future are we on
it's
the verge of?
it's very risky in my view. The big problem is that what they're funding is production, not consumption. I was hopeful that the Conservatives would come out with something
Yeah.
about funding consumption, with tax
Yes.
breaks on subscriptions and that sort of stuff. As long as you're funding production, it gets like the CRTC sort of regime, right? You spend hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars a year funding Canadian content. Nobody watches it, right?
Yes.
But you judge your success on how much you spend in terms of productivity. So now there's going to be less pressure. There will still be some pressure, of course, but less pressure on media to be consumed, as long as they're producing. But the really scary part is that if public trust declines with that group, and a lot of you guys have done polling that shows that the public is deeply suspicious of this. There aren't going to be any headlines about the death of trusted media because they all know that the subsidies don't look good on them. But as that mistrust grows, the less people will leave them, and they'll go elsewhere onto the internet. And I hope that they find trustworthy sources, but they may not.
Yeah.
And that's where you risk a real kind of breakdown in the trust within institutions and that sort of stuff, because there are trustworthy people like yourselves, but you're not covering school board and that's local school boards and that sort of stuff. But if as I say, as people's trust declines, then they just go elsewhere, and elsewhere might be kind of nasty.
You mentioned, Peter, the potential that the Conservatives were ultimately motivated here by being responsive to local outlets, particularly in conservative-held ridings where local MPs, might feel pressure to defend and sustain the subsidies. But pulling it up a bit, like to what extent do you think Postmedia and the Toronto Star, two companies that own the most outlets across the country, have in fact either intentionally or inadvertently caused themselves to become effectively too big to fail, and that their advocacy efforts, particularly Postmedia targeting the Conservatives, is to say, if you don't sustain these subsidies, you are going to be responsible for the dissolution of outlets all across the country because of the holdings of Postmedia. In other words, like Peter, one can't help but wonder that Postmedia has become almost like a nuclear weapon, such that they've put politicians in this excruciating decision about whether to support subsidies or risk its collapse? And is the takeaway that the government should be seriously looking through the Competition Bureau to breaking up Postmedia, so it's not indeed too big to fail?
Well, I mean, there's sort of two things there. The Competition Bureau, I don't know about. I mean, one of the things with the way Postmedia is structured these days is that it's funny to talk about too big to fail, because a great many of the titles that they have right now are actually already dead,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
they're staggering around like zombies, right?
Yes.
There are formerly weekly papers out there that are online only right now that have a minimal number of stories posted to them in a week, maybe a month. They're generally Canadian press stories. So they really aren't functioning as they carry some local advertising, just enough to get in the way of somebody coming into the market and
Yes.
serving it genuinely and covering the school board and sponsoring the minor hockey and doing the sort of things that, you know, Jeff Elgie does a pretty good job of at Village Media. So
Here, here.
I think they've probably convinced people that they're too big to fail. I know publishers at non Torstar doesn't really have that much anymore, but non-Postmedia newspapers who really want Postmedia to fail because they're cluttering up the ecosystem. And I know of other people who can't wait for some of the Postmedia titles to fail so they can run in, buy the title, because those titles still have some pretty good brand values. You know, there's Star Phoenix, the Leader Post, et cetera, the Chronicle Herald, and start something new again.
Yeah.
But what you're doing is subsidizing this sort of death march, because that's how it's going to end, right?
Yes.
Unless it ends with just more and more subsidies so that the hedge fund keeps getting fed.
Yeah.
I think
But
we have
you're
a
not
title
gonna
for
see-
this. I think we have a title for this segment: Postmedia's ongoing death march.
I think the analogy
Well, I mean,
I like
it's been
is
predicted for years, but
Yeah.
like I said, it's what we've missed is that a lot of it already is dead,
yeah.
right?
Well, check
uh,
out their financial statements, because as a part of their financial disclosure each year, they have to write in their subsidies, just like, you know, Alliance Atlantis and all those, you know, Canadian film production companies had to do exactly the same, because investors need to know. It was $11.5 million last year that they collected in just the payroll subsidy, not the new Google money. $11.5 million. This is real money. Final question for you, Peter. What the heck is your advice to outlets like The Hub? I mean, we are one of literally a handful now of hundreds and hundreds of titles in this country who are not accepting any subsidies. And we've done that for reasons of, frankly, independence and trying to be different from the rest of the media. But Peter, we are like, how do we compete? How do we compete when our competitors are accessing these subsidies? They're probably going to get bigger. When the CBC could be expanding and competing against us on every single vertical that we operate, whether it's, you know, digital ads, podcast ads, newsletters. I don't know, Peter, like, what the heck do we do?
I don't know, because it's kind of unimaginable. We're actually in this position where if you want to get into the news business in Canada, you have to take the government's money,
Yeah.
right? And that's a pretty golden set of handcuffs, right? That they're dangling in front of everybody. And it's one thing to sort of dangle the gold in front of you. It's the other thing to have a noose sort of threatening behind you, right? If you don't take the money,
Yeah.
you're not going to live, right? I mean, the hope and the prayer, I guess, and it may be more in hope than expectation, is selling subscriptions. I know, and it depends on your size and your value, and appealing to that. I mean, you're going to come out of this election, you know, like Darrell was just saying, you know, likely, you know, looks like the Liberals are going to win it, that sort of stuff. But as I wrote for you guys at the beginning of this, at the end of this election, there are going to be a lot of people who are very, very disappointed in the media, and they are going to be looking elsewhere. So from a business point of view, I would try to exploit that disappointment as far as I can and sell a few subscriptions.
Yeah. Wise words.
Can I just say
Peter.
something?
Yeah.
Can I just say something, Richard, before we wrap up? For those listeners who may not stay for the live chat, I mean, I think they, particularly those conservatives who tune in every day, they need to understand that this is a case of the Conservative Party of Pierre Poilievre, an ostensible conservative, someone who's characterized himself over the years as a quote unquote libertarian, essentially deciding that we need to have an ongoing government takeover of private news media in Canada. There's nothing conservative about this. This is an acquiescence on the part of Poilievre and the Conservatives to big government entering into the news media, a critical part of our civic life, of our civic infrastructure. You might like the tax cuts you saw. You might like some of the deregulation things that he's announced over the course of this campaign. But this is a massive concession on the part of the Conservative Party to the Trudeau government's agenda, an agenda that they've resisted and opposed for the past decade. And it represents a kind of fundamental failure of conservative politics. If conservative parties are going to champion the government takeover of the private news media, what's the point of conservative parties? Like what do they exist for? What do they stand for? What's its purpose in our political life? I just think it's a massive failure that transcends this election campaign. It speaks to something much deeper about the purpose and role of the Conservative Party in our politics.
Yeah, well said, Sean. Well, you are a dear friend, Peter. You're a fellow janissary in this quixotic battle against state control of our media through massive subsidization. And we're so fortunate to have you on our terrific media podcast, The Full Press, and writing regularly on these and other issues related to the media in the Hub. So listeners, viewers, do check out Peter's work for us at www.thehub.ca. Thanks, Peter. We'll keep up the good fight with your help.
Thanks. Keep the faith, brothers.